Good evening. It is now 6:30, and I will call the October 9th Planning Commission to order. Commissioners, thank you for coming. Staff, thank you. Our first item on the agenda this evening is the approval of the agenda. Commissioners, are there any changes to the agenda?
None for me.
None from commissioners. Any changes from staff?
No changes.
No changes. I would stand for a motion.
So moved.
We have a motion. Second?
Second.
Second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. And motion carries. Our second item on the agenda tonight is the approval of the minutes from the August 28th, 2017 Planning Commission meeting. Are there any changes from staff or commissioners on those minutes? No changes? All right, I would stand for a motion for approval.
So moved.
Second.
Second. All those in favor?
Aye.
And it's approved. Our third item on the agenda tonight is a public hearing, which is an application of the Modern Sportsman LLC for a planned unit development amendment for a retail sporting goods gun shop, shooting range, and training facility. I'm gonna mispronounce this name, for the Hegedus Family LLP for a planned unit development amendment for the existing Abdallah Candies plan located at 3501 County Road 42, and Ms. Dean is presenting.
Good evening, Chair, members of the commission. We do have a plan unit development amendment. Specific location is 3501 County Road 42 West. It's on the corner of County Road 42 and Burnsville Parkway on the southwest corner. Property is zoned I3, and it's a planned unit development. It's also surrounded by I3 zoning as well as industrial office guiding surrounding the area. Switching over to the aerial photo, the building was initially built in 1997 with an expansion in 2004. The property is an unplatted piece of property. As you can tell from the red outline, the property technically extends into the into County Road 42. As part of one of the conditions that's proposed is that if this is approved tonight, a condition would be to plat the property so that it conforms to our subdivision ordinance. That was listed within the staff report and again is included as a condition. The site currently stands as a registered land survey. Getting to the actual site, the proposal is primarily for the Modern Sportsman. The use of the Modern Sportsman includes a gun range, retail sales of sporting type equipment, also some office and training location within the floor plan. The Modern Sportsman would occupy approximately 19,000 square feet or 1/3 of the building. Abdallah Candies is the existing primary user of the space. However, they would be downsizing to approximately 40,000 square feet of space. The little history, Abdallah Candy again was approved in 1997, expanded in 2004, and then a large portion of their operation moved to Apple Valley recently in early 2017, vacating a portion of the building, thus giving opportunity to lease out tenant space to this prospective tenant as well as potential future tenants. I should point out also on the site plan, when asked about parking for the submitted application, the applicant provided a parking chart showing how much parking was available on site for not only the existing uses within the site, but also the proposed use. They are showing a proof of parking area within the west side of the building, or west of the building area indicated here in yellow. That proposed proof of parking would occupy some of the required landscaping. Staff is not in support of that additional proof of parking because parking on site, as well as the inclusion of 9 parking stalls on the north part of the building, they will meet parking requirements. So staff felt that the inclusion of that proof of parking is a necessity from a city code standpoint. Also, it would eliminate some of that required landscaping. Modern Sportsman is proposing to add a small vestibule on the north part of their part of the building should they occupy the site, as well as, again, modifying some of the area on just north of the building, adding 9 parking spaces. Currently, there is landscaping and a couple of trees. In 2004, as part of the plan, the north parking was shown as proof of parking. This gives you a view of, zoomed in, of the Modern Sportsman floor plan. There is a retail component to the Modern Sportsman. I'll get you the numbers in just a minute. So in yellow is the retail area. The range area is within green, and then office, lounge, and storage within the bluish purple area. So the Modern Sportsman would occupy approximately 3,000 square feet of retail area. And the Abdallah Candies would occupy approximately 1,300 square feet of retail area. So essentially, going back to the two uses, Abdallah Candies currently has manufacturing, warehousing of product, which is permitted within the industrial zoning district. They do want to retain a portion of that retail for their candy sales, as well as some storage of product and some hand dipping operation on site. The Modern Sportsman, a portion of their proposal is in line with I3 or industrial, the office component. However, the range component is not a permitted use within the I3 zoning district. In addition, the retail component of just over 3,000 square feet exceeds the retail allotment for an industrial building. Within industrial, we do have a cap on the maximum amount of retail, and the retail does have to be associated with storage on site. So just a note about that. Again, some just minor modifications to accommodate the proposed tenant use of the Modern Sportsman. A vestibule entry area would be the only change on the north elevation, as well as proposed signage for the use. The vestibule is approximately 90 square feet. Portion of my PowerPoint is not here. I'm going to switch over to different PowerPoint.
Chair, would you mind if I had a question?
Go right ahead.
I'm going to direct this to Deb. Deb, help us with not being platted. Is everything in the South Cross District RLS, or why would that not be platted with the age of the property?
The, a number of properties are platted, not all of them are, however. And the council back in the day did not require platting. So there, we have a number of projects that, when they come in, it's on unplatted property. So what the current requirement is, based on our subdivision ordinance and the city council direction, is to, when you need to have a land use clearance application, if the property is not platted, at that time, you would plat.
Okay.
Yeah, the overall site shows that even the two adjacent parcels to the west are not platted either yet.
Thank you, Deb. Thank you. There are, as mentioned briefly before in the presentation, there are some requested PUD deviations. One is the deviation from 30% required green space to 27.4 green space. And this is, pertains to those 14 proof of parking stalls, that area. If that green space is eliminated, it would be below the city code requirement, and staff does not support that request. There is also a deviation to allow the just over 3,000 square feet of retail space for the Modern Sportsman. This also equates to 16.7% of their proposed tenant space. Staff does support that request as it's in line with what we've done in the past for industrial zoning districts, if the request is made, and if they're under 20% for 5 tenants or less. Another deviation is a deviation to allow Abdallah Retail to continue, however, without the required manufacturing warehouse on site. So currently, it's described that they do have some warehousing and manufacturing of their product at this location. And so the retail operation essentially can continue. And if the manufacturing warehouse should be eliminated, and they perhaps rent out the future tenant space to another office warehouse tenant, that they could keep the retail there. However, in the staff report, it's mentioned, should the Abdallah Candy completely leave the site, that would be eliminated from the PUD approval. There are PUD benefits. Whenever we're looking at making some exceptions to city code, we also look at what are the benefits to the city, what are the benefits to the site and the surrounding area, the general community. If the use of the Modern Sportsman is approved, it would fill a vacant tenant space. It's been vacant for some time. As described in the narrative for the Modern Sportsman, their proposed wages are expected to be higher than a typical warehouse and manufacturing type job. The proposed Modern Sportsman use is an off-peak use from the Abdallah Candy current use. And the land use clearance does comply with the subdivision ordinance. So if this is approved, one of the conditions or the next steps would be that they would have to plat the property, and that would bring it into closer compliance to our city code, which is a benefit. Staff does recommend approval of the proposal. One of the conditions is that a master sign plan shall be submitted to the planning department prior to release of any sign permit for the new tenant, and that the sign permit shall meet code. We do require a sign plan if there's a multi-tenant situation, and this is standard practice. We also recommend that the application for the preliminary and final plat by Hedges Family LLP shall be submitted and deemed complete prior to building permit issuance for the Modern Sportsman, and that final occupancy shall not be issued for the Modern Sportsman until the plat is approved and recorded on the property. This ensures that the plat is completed and finalized and done because of the land use clearance and change. That the accessory retail for the existing Abdallah Candy Store shall be terminated if or when the candy store closes. If this approval goes forward, it can certainly remain. However, if it completely vacates, we would, from a staff standpoint, want this to align with industrial office, the I3 zoning, how the area is intended to be used. The site plan shall be revised prior to building permit issuance to eliminate the 14 future parking stalls on the west side of the building, and that the existing landscaping shall remain. With that, if there's any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer. I believe the ownership as well as the applicant for this item tonight are in the audience.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Dean. Commissioners, do you have any questions for staff or the applicant at this moment? Commissioner Benke?
Ms. Dean, just curious, is the Burnsville firing range, is that also an I3 property?
Yes, it is I3. The current I3 zoning does not list firearm range as a permitted use. We do have our I1 zoning, our GIH zoning, I2 zoning that allow firearm ranges as a permitted use.
Sure.
From looking back in history, we believe that this came in prior to our current code and that it's basically grandfathered in.
Yeah, it did. I was part of getting that one built, the building. Okay. And then the only other thing was I was a little unclear at first about the comment about Abdallah leaving and having the use terminate. I do see it as a condition. I guess normally the conditions run with land, and this is okay to have an allowed use be terminated by ordinance, essentially?
That's a good question. Typically, what we've done in the past is a specific interim use.
Okay,
So I may have to get clarification from our city attorney on that.
okay, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Benke. Commissioners, any questions? Commissioner Badger?
Thank you, Chair. Help me clarify the proof of parking and the 14 so the applicant truly wants the 14 spots, or they believe they needed that to meet code as they were doing the plan, and we're saying they don't need it given accessory parking, and can you help me with the history of why?
Right, so when the applicant initially approached the city and we had a sit-down conversation and through our memos back and forth, one of the things as a staff we asked for is how do you meet the parking requirement? And that's typical for any either application or just a general inquiry. So they displayed how they're using each space within the building and projected the numbers based off of that. In their narrative, they do mention that they're willing to work with the city to get that parking number, I guess, right. And you can certainly bring the applicant up to clarify, but I believe that the parking that is on the plan is sufficient. Even the parking that's out there today is sufficient.
Okay.
For the uses.
Okay. And
The floor is yours.
then a little bit of clarification on Commissioner Benke started, but so for Abdallah, it does seem kind of odd that this is tied, but it states as the accessory retail for the existing Abdallah Candy Store shall be terminated if or when the candy store closes. I thought that would be based around if manufacturing stopped. I mean, if the candy, I was a little confused. If the candy store closes, it's not operating. Help me with why that's worded versus in our background when it talks about manufacturing and required manufacturing for retail space in the South Cross District.
Okay, so the retail, currently how it sits right now, they were approved through a planning and development to have retail and the manufacturing. If, let's say, just the north part remains a retail store, manufacturing goes away, it goes to some other tenant. We're saying the candy store can remain. Now, if a shoe store wants to go in that space, and has nothing, and they don't have any, and the rest of the building is some other, I guess, random tenant.
Okay, all right.
Staff is saying that a shoe store shouldn't be allowed to go in there because the intent of the highway or the County Road 42 corridor in this specific area is intended to be industrial and office in nature and not necessarily a retail corridor in this area. As you get closer to Burnsville Center, yes, but in this specific area, no.
So then, once again, just to clarify, with the way it's worded, we're good with Abdallah Candy staying, regardless of manufacturing, just if they choose to close that particular store, the land use going forward with that small retail that doesn't tie with manufacturing goes away.
Correct.
At that point, okay. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Commissioner Benke?
I just need to carry that a little farther now. So if somebody else came in who had a manufacturing warehouse facility and also needed a retail store, they wouldn't automatically get that back. They would have to apply for another PUD amendment in order to use that space, or it would never be allowed to be a retail space in the future.
Retail is allowed as accessory to a principal use.
It's just this one, as is, would not carry forward. It would need to be reapplied for.
Correct.
That, okay. Thank you.
I'm going to clarify that one more time. So I just, so we're to simplify that, if John's Shoes comes in and is manufacturing John's Shoes in the back and wants to sell them in the front, as it sits today with this, we're okay with that. If Abdallah wants to stay and John's Shoes wants to manufacture in the back, we're okay with that, but not the inverse. So John's Shoes couldn't sell with a different manufacturing company in the back. They would have to be the same
Right.
company. Okay.
I don't think that's what this says, though. This says when the candy store closes, it goes away. So any new use would need to reapply. Which is, they'd have to reapply for a number of things, so it's just,
The intended point of that is to say that we don't want a separate retail and a separate manufacturing happening at the same time. Correct?
Retail needs to be associated with the manufacturing. And what we're trying to accomplish here is that Abdallah has been there, forever. And then they have relocated a substantial part of their operation, but they still want to maintain their candy store. And because it's a PUD, staff is recommending that they be allowed to do that. But at some point, if that goes away, you can't just open up another retail in there. It has to be something that's ancillary or accessory to whatever other use would go in.
Okay. I'm clear on that. Is there any other questions for staff on this? If not,
I think, I guess I should ask staff about it, because I don't know if it's appropriate for the owner. I guess I'm really struggling with the vestibule as an entry compared to the entry or to the entire Abdallah's building, and especially to the Abdallah's entry, and especially if Abdallah's stays as a candy store and somebody else takes over the other portion of the building as warehouse, and then there's another entry there. I'm not sure, how did staff, how did that come through that entry is consistent or appropriate given what Abdallah's currently has?
The proposal meets our city code requirements as far as the glass requirement. The applicant does need a vestibule as part of their business operations, and staff didn't see any issues with the proposal.
Okay, I see a huge difference in size and bulk. It doesn't have to match, but it just seems like it's a backdoor to me. And if there was another one on the east side of the building, for example, we've sort of established a precedent that that kind of an opening is appropriate given the rest of the building. Okay.
Any other questions for staff, Mr. Mankey? Anybody? All right. I will ask the applicant if they're here to come up and maybe just give us a little background on how we landed on this and if we have any questions. I don't know. Are they here?
Here.
Yep, right there is good. Thank you. If you can
So
give
how we
us,
landed on this spot specifically, or
just kind of, if you could give us your name and address for the record before.
John McConkey, and I'm from Prior Lake, 3358 James Court.
I just wanted to give you an opportunity, Mr. McConkey, to kind of just talk about the change in use and the business a little bit, and if we had questions, we could ask.
Yeah, so we're currently operating just a couple miles from here in Savage, or a couple miles down 42 in Savage, right behind McHugh's, right by Aldi. And so just need more space, and based on demand that we're seeing in our marketplace, we necessary for us to expand. Did look into a few spots previously, but it's super tough to find a building that's compatible with the use, so here's where we fell, and really hopeful it works out.
Great. Is there any questions for the applicant while we have them up there? Commissioner Bradrick?
Just for our background said that you have online sales and kind of expanding the store. It didn't look like, were you doing shipping from online in another location, or will all that come out of this location, or what's kind of the business model going forward?
It'll all be done from this location, so part of it, and see the little rectangle in the corner, that'll be a packing area.
Warehouse and shipping?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's your origin, correct, is online?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
See, we do read our background. Thanks.
Yep, thank you. Any other questions for the applicant while we have him? Commissioner Vinkie?
It looks like you're removing the trees from the front of the building because that's where your entry is going to be.
I'd like to keep what we can there. I'm not sure exactly. Initially, we talked about removing 2 of them and replacing them with other trees or smaller trees that wouldn't interfere with the signage.
Had you looked at creating more of an entry? Something that
So
might-
one of the issues that we run into in our business is meeting security code. And I know that picture, on the black and white, looked a little off, but I think in color it looked quite a bit different because their entrance is pretty small.
So you have to have some specialized security at the door?
Yeah.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
okay.
Any other questions? None? Okay, thank you for giving us some clarification and for bringing an application in tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks. If there's no other questions, I will open the public hearing for this item. And anybody that would like to speak to this item can come to the podium and give us your name and address for the record. Hello.
Good evening, I'm Ginger Strom Deering, and we owned all this property before it was developed. And the building that we own is the first building that was there, and it's right next to Abdella's. And between our 2 buildings is a small area which is not a road, it's a driveway. To the parking lots, which is very narrow, owned partly by Abdella's and partly by us. My concern is, how wide is that going to be? And is 2-way traffic going to go through there when cars are parked? Because right now they're using our front parking lot as a service road to get into Abdella's instead of going on the other service road, because they can come off of 42 on you and then look down there and see Abdella's. So they go right down there. Safety is my issue. And I wasn't aware of what it was till I got here, so I'm not very prepared. Sorry.
It's okay. Your building is the one to the west of the Abdallah building?
Yes,
Okay.
Where Minuteman Press is located?
yes.
Okay.
Yeah, LaSalle.
I guess, I don't have an answer for you right now, but, I think in hearing that, staff will take that consideration into it,
Okay.
before it does go to the council, and if it is an issue, can they contact staff to follow up on that, or?
I can maybe provide some clarification. As part of the application, parking was shown on the west side of the building where the landscaping is, which would add sidewalk, landscaping strip, parking, and a drive aisle, which may back into or next to your property. Staff is not recommending that that option move forward. So from that standpoint, if that moves forward as a recommendation, the west part of the property would not change from how it looks today. The only change would be potentially to the north part of the property where the trees are currently located. We don't anticipate a higher volume of traffic than what you see today. I don't have the title work in front of me, but typically there's cross-access agreements that go through common and shared driveways. There may be something spelled out as well in private agreements as well, but we can look at that further.
Okay.
At one time, there was an exit off of 42 that went along the road between our two buildings. And when 42 was expanded, that was removed. And the city was going to put in a curbing that would kind of break up the traffic that went through. But somehow that never happened. So it is a dangerous situation. So I just wanted to reinforce that and take a good look at that space. I appreciate it.
Thank you for
Thank
coming
you.
out tonight. Is there anybody else that would like to speak to this item tonight at the public hearing? Seeing nobody, I will close the public hearing and I will hand it over to the commission for any discussion or a motion. If there's any discussion to be had.
None from the
Commissioners,
commission.
no discussion? Well, then I would stand for a motion at this time if there's no discussion further on this item.
Chair, I would like to make a motion.
Commissioner?
I would like the planning commission recommend approval to the city council for the application of the Modern Sportsman LLC for a planned unit development amendment for retail sporting goods, gun shop, shooting range, and training facility for the Hedges Family LLP for a planned unit development amendment for the existing Abdallah Candies located at 3501 County Road 42 West.
Thank you, Commissioner Brederick. We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
Second by Commissioner Marovich. All of those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? And the motion passes. And that will go before the city council, well, it'll be on the city council agenda October 17th. And I don't know if they've changed their meeting times yet.
I don't know when that goes into effect.
I think it's the end of October.
We'll need to verify the
It
time.
might be 6:30, it might be 5:30. So if you keep your eyes peeled, you probably find out. I don't have the answer for that, so. But thank you and welcome to Burnsville. Our next item on the agenda this evening is another public hearing to consider changes to Title 10, Chapter 4, Chapter 19, and Chapter 23 regarding changes to commercial and industrial exterior architectural materials, standards, and definitions. And Mr. Weber is presenting.
Planning Commission, thank you for having me back. Just kind of a summary, this is our fourth meeting regarding this subject. The original scope of the project was to evaluate Burnsville's architectural material standards and the process to evaluate deviations from those material standards, comparing Burnsville to 11 other cities. And at our second meeting, we reviewed a number of the we reviewed the other communities compared to Burnsville, and from that, we got direction from the Planning Commission that the process in which Burnsville does the approvals and grants deviations was sufficient, but there were some changes that were requested to the building materials themselves, most specifically to allow a greater percentage of the secondary building materials. And at our third meeting with the Planning Commission, we brought forward some deviation or some amendments to the city code. And at that meeting, there were two specific items that were discussed. First, that in the metal accent material definition, there was the term oil canning, and that oil canning could not occur. And then secondly, discussion about corrugated metal and whether that should be allowed or not. It's not in the presentation, but I will just point to, I prepared a memo that's attached to the Planning Commission staff report that discussed those two items. As I stated at our last meeting, I was going to evaluate the International Property Maintenance Code, which the city has adopted, and see how that deals with metal exterior materials and whether that could address the oil canning. I believe that that is properly addressed, as was called out in specifics in the memorandum. So when we go through the amendments, you'll see that that language is removed. Secondly, regarding the corrugated metal, I researched basically three different types of businesses and or professions and how they use corrugated metal. I reviewed some architectural firms and the metal, specifically the type and thickness of the metal that they use in corrugated materials. I looked at the more typical agricultural pole buildings that often use corrugated metal siding, and then I looked at what is commonly available to residents through the Home Depot and Menards website. What I found was that both the Home Depot and Menards website, as well as the agricultural pole buildings, use corrugated metal that is usually 29 gauge, while they do have some available at 26 gauge. And just for everybody's help, particularly those in the audience, when we're talking about gauges of thickness, the lower the number, the thicker it is. So if it was a 1 gauge, that's a thick material compared to, you get up to 29, that's thinner. Looking at the architectural firms that were using corrugating metal, they were commonly using basically between 16 and 24 gauge corrugated metal. There were some references to some thicker, up to 12 gauge, as well as some use of 26 gauge metal. So seeing that the architectural firms are using the thicker of the corrugated metals and the stuff that is normally available to residents and used in more agricultural buildings are the thinner, I arrived at the recommendation that corrugated metal that is 24 gauge or thicker could be used as a secondary material, where corrugated metal that is 25 gauge or thinner would continue to be prohibited. Currently, all corrugated metal is prohibited. So with those two clarifications, I'd like to go through the sections of the code that are proposed to be revised. I'm going to go through the first 6 sections or so because the commercial and the industrial code is identical language, so the proposed changes are identical. So I'm not going to basically repeat the same changes. So again, to start with, there's an existing definition in Chapter 4, Section 2, that was specific to architectural metal panels. Paneling is allowed as an exterior material, so there was an architectural metal panel definition. We've modified this to just be architectural metal for an exterior material. So you'll see first the strikeout is removing the term panel. and then adding some language to clarify that this is an exterior building material. The big change is that metal must be designed and manufactured to be exposed, and that it is used as it was intended. Then the part that was stricken was metal panel shall not oil can, and it shall not have exposed fasteners. As I stated earlier, the memo goes into more detail on why I believe that the current city code, specifically the International Property Maintenance Code, already addresses those issues that can be handled without this separate definition. And then if you recall, when we looked at specifically the Target and in Edina and in Richfield, they did have exposed fasteners. That is becoming a more common architectural style, so we removed the prohibition on exposed fasteners. So section 2, this is actually new from our last meeting. This is chapter 7, section 20, maintenance. This is an existing standard. What we are doing is we're adding section 4-8-1 of this title. That is the reference to the International Property Maintenance Code. And then it's always good policy to kind of reference other sections of the code, so that way if Burnsville was ever to change the year of the International Property Maintenance Code or some other change to that section, we don't have to find other references. This deals specifically with the Property Maintenance Code, so if the city ever chose to choose a newer year, if an update came along, we don't need to modify this section of the code. Section 3 is actually a typo compared to the way the code normally reads. This is at the very last parentheses, currently reads, this area shall be counted as the numeral 1 element. Normally, as you can see in the previous sentence, you spell out the number and then use the numeral. So we're just doing an update here. It doesn't really have a substantial meaning. It's just to keep that same nomenclature going forward. So this is the couple of changes that we discussed. Major exterior materials means that a building could be predominantly any of these materials. So this is not making things more liberal or more easy to use. It's just trying to clarify a couple things that are in the current code. Cast in place before had to be approved either through a conditional use permit or a planned unit development. This now allows cast in place material as a permitted use, not needing special approval. There is currently the prohibition on painted materials, so that is being removed. Now you would be able to paint materials that exist. The last addition there essentially is to address painting itself. It is stating that any exterior material, included painting exterior materials, must comply with section 304.2 of the International Property Maintenance Code. So that specifically deals with chipping and peeling paint, that must be replaced in a timely manner. I think the more substantial changes are in these two sections. Before, there wasn't two sections. There wasn't a limited exterior material and a prohibited material. There was a title called restricted exterior materials. So we thought it was a little confusing that it talked about a certain amount of materials that were just banned, and then a certain amount of materials that could be up to 25%. So we decided to break these into two separate sections to provide a little bit more clarity. So first, the limited exterior materials. This is essentially the language previously from the restricted materials, except for the percentage has gone up from 25% to 50%. And the only other caveat I would state is that we also carried over the provision for painted exterior materials must still meet the International Building Maintenance Code. So while this is underlined looking like it's completely new, it's actually A lot of it is carried over when we split the section. The only other part I'd point out here is that before it just said, it went on to say, all exterior walls on a building shall be fiber cement, siding, wood, or metal accent materials. Now we added that 24 gauge or thicker metal accent materials. So I would want to clarify that because this would be any metal, not just corrugated metal. Any metal used on an exterior would need to be 24 gauge or thicker. So down in the section 6 here, this is modifying that restricted existing material to be now prohibited. So you'll see most of that is the same. What we added is specifically that 25 gauge or thinner corrugated metal or unfinished metal is prohibited. So that's where we added that thickness that I discussed earlier. So I'll go through it visually. 7, 8, 9, and 10 are the same changes. It's just we need those sections because we have, while it's the same language, we have a section about commercial materials and we have a section about industrial materials. Now you may wonder why we have two separate sections if it's the same language. This is specific to exterior materials. There's a lot of other performance standards for the two districts, parking, landscaping, other uses. There's some differences between the two there. The building materials are the same language for both the existing commercial and industrial, and this proposed amendment would keep the same changes to both the commercial and industrial. As was stated in the beginning, this does require a public hearing, but before I open it up to the chair for any questions, Chair Workman was at the City Council work session where these direction for some of these changes were discussed, so I'd like to have an opportunity for him to give any update that wasn't covered during my presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Zuber. At that meeting, Ms. Faulkner presented to the city council with myself, and the feedback, if you didn't catch the meeting, was, to summarize, was to maybe be more generous with metal, corrugated metal in our ordinance, and that there didn't seem to be an issue from their perspective with metal, whether it be corrugated or otherwise. And so that seems to be the feeling there from at least the 4 council members that spoke to it. It's just relax the metal. And nothing really more specific than that. I think Ms. Faulkner did mention something about a staff recommendation regarding a PUD or conditional use permit that was going to be brought up tonight maybe, but I don't know if there was anything specific to that. But that was to summarize kind of what was touched on. So with that, are there any questions for Mr. Zweber as it sits with the ordinance red line that we have in front of us now? I have a quick question. Did you raise your hand?
I thought that would be more for us.
Okay, well, for discussion, I guess my question, and anybody can answer this, is what metal that's 25 gauge or higher, it appears you can buy at Home Depot or Menards. So what is the intended use of that? Is that more for residential? I'm kind of looking at you when I ask this question.
Yeah, well, and that's sort of what I was looking at here too, and taking Eric's comments into account, and as well as the comment that you related from the city council. I guess typically if you're going to be using a product on an industrial building, you're going to be using architectural quality material, not necessarily residential quality material. And I guess my only concern as a designer is somebody then taking residential quality material, basically farm material, and using it for a use that's not intended for. And I think we're starting to almost open up a disconnect in what we're asking them to do, even though we're relaxing things. So to me, the stuff that you would get at Home Depot is gonna be lighter weight. It's not gonna be intended for commercial or industrial warehouse type buildings. We don't apply this to residential. I mean, this is, that's not something that we have this kind of detail in terms of what's allowed and what's not allowed. From my point of view, leaving the restriction in is appropriate given the kind of buildings and the associated quality that would go with them. That's my opinion.
The restriction as it's written currently.
As it's currently written. I mean,
Here.
all you're doing is you're eliminating somebody from going down and getting a very light-duty corrugated product that is really only intended and rated for home construction or a barn or a rural construction and putting it on a building that it might not be durable. And I think that sort of seems to be the key of what we're angling this is at, is we don't really care what you're using as long as it's durable. So if all of a sudden the stuff at Home Depot that's meant for farms and things isn't as durable or appropriate for the higher quality construction, then I don't think we'd want to confuse people by having them both point at each other and disagree.
My follow-up question to that would be, is a lot of what we're seeing now is maybe not even hitting a 25% or even a 50% threshold, but where developers and designers are putting in pockets of design that, it might just run a thin line up a building, and maybe that material might be appropriate for that feature. And I'm not an architect or a designer, but are we putting those people out on an island by completely eliminating the possibility of 25 gauge or thinner?
Yeah, I don't know, quite honestly. I know that a lot of the elements you talked about, the Richfield, Home Depot, and Target, for example, that is a heavy-duty product. I mean, gauge-wise, it's nowhere near the threshold we're talking about. I think that most architects, when they design a building, are not going to go to Home Depot and spec the product. They're going to spec from a local supplier that handles the material that's appropriate for this for commercial construction.
Okay.
I think maybe that's the disconnect here, is that Home Depot sells a product to residential, and we're talking about commercial buildings.
Mm-hmm.
And a commercial design is going to have a commercial spec. The specification that the architect writes is going to say, I want this product because it's going to be the right product for my client. It's going to be durable. He's not going to have to come back and repair it or replace it in 5 years or 15 years or 25 years. Most of these buildings are built forever.
So would you say that this is a quality standard to ensure that the building or whatever material they use is of quality and that we're not allowing for maybe lesser quality into a design?
I don't know that, because, you can get all kinds of different quality. I think really it's back to, it's a product that's intended for a commercial building,
Okay.
as opposed to something that's not.
That was my only piece of this, is I didn't want to put the city of Burnsville in a position where developers maybe wanted to, there was a design theme or style out there that maybe used a thinner gauge, and we were creating a hardship for that. But if
I may.
But I'm not in that world, so I don't know if that's
Yeah.
something that's.
If I may, I mean, thinner metals are used. They're just typically backed. They're laminated onto other products. Spandrel panels, which is where you have a glass wall and you have a window with a metal panel underneath it. That's not just a piece of metal floating there. It's actually laminated to a substructure that keeps it flat and looking good. So, I mean, I don't think we've eliminated that product from any commercial design, because it doesn't oil can because it's laminated. It's as actually part of a different product. it becomes a spandrel panel, and it's not just architectural metal. So I don't think we've eliminated that either.
That begs the question then, if you wanted to buy a thinner gauge metal and laminate it onto something more durable, are we then excluding that possibility?
Maybe, but
If I could,
Yeah.
I think we may be eliminating that, but part of, I think, to Commissioner Benke's point is that process is happening in a climate-controlled manufacturing facility that may be using, a certain amount of air pressure to keep it there. I don't think this is something we want to encourage somebody going out and doing it on site.
Sure.
yeah, I think once again, you're looking at, if it's a commercial building, it's typically built with a commercial process behind it. And you're not having someone going out into their garage or workshop and creating these panels. I mean, somebody could, and I think we could still allow them to have a CUP to do this. It's just not, it's just not the normal thing that you'd expect. So, what we're saying is, hey, all of the normal processes that go with commercial buildings are now okay, which I think is our goal.
Well, and to your point, I mean, we don't want some guy up there with a cocking gun, throwing barn metal on the side of his building. But I just hesitate with prohibited sometimes, just because if, that developer does come in and wants to put something up and there is something on the market that we're not aware of now, or maybe in 5 or 10 years, are we stopping that from happening? I'm not overly married to it, but I just wanted to vet that now before anything happens. That was the only horse I have in this race, so if anybody else has any questions or discussion points,
Wouldn't that still be a CUP application if somebody had? We're gonna run into new products every day. I mean, and it, it's hard to look forward. I mean, we're coming in on the back door in Corrugated right now because of where other people are on it. So, I mean, we're really addressing that one sort of in hindsight. But, I don't know that, from what I've read here, I don't know that we've really limited things too much outside of perhaps a minor quality issue.
If I could, I think the way this is written, the prohibited materials may require a PUD instead of a CUP, but there is still a process that would allow people to come in, demonstrate why they're choosing that material, why that's the right application. To your Chairman Workman, to your other point, you don't always know what's not currently available, but will be available in 5 or 10 years if that happens. That's why you review these codes every once in a while, but you can't really guess what's not on the market yet. Sure.
An applicant can also make application to amend the ordinance to include, different materials as well. So it says prohibited, but it's not really. It just means that you would need to go through some process with planning commission and council review.
Which is sort of where too many things maybe are right now, and I think the more we can trim out, the better. Just a little piece on that too. If somebody is designing a building that may need a PUD amendment, if that's the correct thing for a particular kind of a siding, I would wager that there's more to the building that might also need a PUD. In other words, we're not having somebody typically just come in for that issue. It's probably part of a larger design concept, and I don't personally think too many people are going to be set back by that as a single item.
okay. Commissioner Bradrick.
Mr. Zwieber, first of all, thanks. This has been, in my opinion, a pretty long process, and I was one of the people a couple years ago that requested this because I felt like we had undue regulation on businesses requiring a condition or a planned unit development. As an example of a car dealership, I wanted to be able to streamline that process. So on the more positive note, we seem to have one area that's a little bit of a contention, but I think it's a huge improvement to be able to go from 25 to 50%. Hopefully that will allow some future applications to not have to go through a PUD. I think it's a big move that we've moved away from exposed fasteners, that we're going to allow that, because the rest of the world, in my opinion, allows that today. Pretty excited about cast, tilt-up concrete. That product today is not what it was 5 years ago, and it's definitely not what it was 10 years ago. And if you go back to 20 years ago when they built the dome, that was what we had. And so I think that's a huge move. To Commissioner Benke's point, we're a bit behind the times on all of that. And then I think painting brick is huge. As a community, I think we've got some built in the 60s and 70s and aging properties that this can address. So all in all, I think this was great work, and I appreciate everything the staff has done. I guess my question, to get a little bit about the 25 gauge and higher and lower, by having us have a limitation of the 25 gauge, and you may have given this, so I apologize, with one of the multiple meetings, but does that make us in any way, shape, or form an outlier of other communities with the 25 gauge as kind of being the line in the sand?
No, because what we discovered was there's probably about 40% of the communities that we looked at that are much more prescriptive and descriptive than you are. And then there were probably about 40% of the communities that had very little, to a couple communities that had no language at all about materials. But when we looked at that, the communities that had very little to no language required everything as a conditional use permit or planned unit development. So it was negotiated every time. So their code may have looked cleaner, but when you looked at the process, it was actually much more complicated. So I would say, as a level of detail that you have here, you're probably in the middle, but really in the middle of about 20%. There's a lot of communities that are much more descriptive and a lot of communities that are less. But what we found was the communities, if I recall correctly, Egan, that had a lot of description and a lot of different language if you're within sight of a public right-of-way compared to not in a public right-of-way, they just allowed things permitted. They didn't have to get a conditional use permit or a planned unit development, but that's because the city council went through and really described what happened. So if you needed any change from what their very prescriptive code was, you were doing a PUD or requesting a text amendment. So I guess that's a long-winded answer of saying, what we discovered was it's not just the language, it's the process you have to go through married with the language. Where we believed you were in the process, it was you were a little more friendly than most, because particularly with the conditional use permit, that's not the same as a text amendment or a PUD. It was a little easier to get changes. But when we looked at what was allowed and how restrictive you were about right in the middle. So what we heard from the Planning Commission was, let's try to get a little bit more friendly than the middle, and that's kind of where we're at. So I don't think we can look simply at, okay, 24 gauge and 25 gauge, are we more or less descriptive than our neighbors? Because you also have to look at what is their approval process in that as well.
So for the entire package, your opinion is we're going to be a little more business-friendly than people around us? Okay.
That's my opinion, yes.
Thank you. Staff, I have in recent memory, boy, I'm going to tax you now. Are you aware of anybody that has come to us with an application wanting to use anywhere from a 25 to a 29 gauge that's been in front of us, or has anyone even asked, have we had people asking for it? I'm not putting you, but you.
That specification, no, I don't know of any
Yeah.
that has come in with a specification, something to that,
So, thank you.
Good question.
So I guess I have a comment. So I would be in favor of the the amendment to our title code as stated, mostly because of what I mentioned before. I do believe, one of the things that, and the city council may definitely do something a little different, but kind of our realm is what's the right thing to do for code? What are unintentional consequences? I believe we've moved quite a little ways into the future, and I believe that down the road, no different than other things, if we get a fair amount of applicants that there's an issue with a 29 or a 25 gauge, I guess we would look at it. From my personal experiences in the industry and being in other communities and development that is going on today, with a fair amount of architectural metal, I'm unaware of anybody that's trying to use today, in my personal opinion, a 25 gauge weight. It's not a good use for a commercial property from a long-term stability of the home. It'd be like putting the cheapest vinyl siding you could find on a home. It's just not the right business decision. So my gut is we won't see this. So that's my stand.
I'm glad you guys are here.
Deb, Gina, do you even see an architect spec on a submittal at this level?
Typically not.
So you wouldn't even know what they're proposing outside of it being labeled as a metal panel?
The details usually come at time of building permit.
Right.
Occasionally, you'll get a contractor
Or a
that
spec,
submits a
yeah.
spec.
Well, if you have samples, obviously, you might have a product here, but then it's actually touchy-feely. You can actually see what it's like. Okay, I guess my only other issue, I think, and again, and I apologize, it's not really something that's been highlighted before or anything. When I look at, under section 8, where it talks about stucco, synthetic stucco, fiber cement, vertical siding shall not be allowed within 24 inches from grade. I guess I'm a little struck by what that may or may not be unintentionally doing. I know that on at least one or two other products, I've talked about how it's nice to have a base, a durable base, but it certainly isn't the only way to design a building. The building can have a consistent face. And I was looking through the, oh shoot, no, it doesn't even tell me which elements it's in here. It's in the current building code. And it talks about design, there it is, 1019-1, and special requirements and performance standards for all business and mixed-use districts, which I believe is in front of the section that we're currently looking at. What are we at here? It's actually, well, and I think the language actually is in this as well, Eric. So I think it may be the next section, but I think it's also here. It's right there. And what I'm looking at here is it says building design and materials, and then it drops down to number 1, design elements. All new building fronts and refacing of existing buildings shall include a minimum of 3 of the following elements. Then it lists, 8 different things. One of which is item E, a combination of horizontal and vertical design features. And the reason I bring this up is that if you have one of these products that are now allowed and you're requiring them to not bring them to ground, you have essentially pushed them into a layered building. It has an automatic horizontal break. And to me, is that something that we were trying to do, or is that simply a result of having 2 ordinance items that are actually going against each other?
The, within 24 inches, that's been in there forever and ever.
No, and
because
believe-
they've had,
Right.
because they used to have issues with water damage.
Correct. Used to, I think that's the word again. And believe me, I love buildings with bases. But I'm just saying where we have it in both in the heart of the city and in this current ordinance where the horizontal layering is an option, if they chose a product that was durable, and I'm always going to come back to that, because as far as I'm concerned, if the product is durable, I don't really care what it is, and I want the designer to have the ability to play with it. So I'm just curious if that should, I mean, I think it probably should stay for now, but at least I want to open up a discussion about it, that is that something that's appropriate in today's world and with the other elements of our ordinance? I'll put a question mark on the end of that.
If I could just clarify, they only point out 3 specific materials that cannot be within 24 inches. Stucco, synthetic stucco. So I think in a lot of terms, that could be the same material, in a lot of people's opinion. Fiber cement, vertical paneling. So there's a lot of materials that they could use within 24 inches.
And continue above and below it, I agree. I think there was another chunk of this too that actually listed additional major exterior elements. I mean, this is face brick, stone, stucco, glass, synthetic stucco, fiber cement. Okay, that's where they come in. Architectural concrete, precast concrete. This doesn't have any wood listed. It doesn't have any, other materials that we might say today are popular. There's quite a few buildings I've seen where people are putting a distressed wood product on. So that comes under limited, thank you, limited exterior. I apologize, I've got a cold. I think everybody has heard that except the audience. So here we have fiber cement, siding, wood, or the metal, and those come under limited. Wood is not addressed in the previous restricted items, so technically wood could be used within 24 inches of ground.
That's the way it's stated here, and then the, our provision to, excuse me, section 2 here, maintenance, that if it was improperly sealed, or even if it was properly sealed, but it would come to rot, it would, this provision would make them replace it.
And I agree. I think, again, we're looking at, is that the durable product, and is the term durable, I mean, I see that also in that same section I'm reading from. This is under A, first item. All buildings shall be designed to accomplish the goals and policies of the comp plan. Building materials should be attractive in appearance, of a durable finish, and be of a quality that's compatible and harmonious with adjacent structures. All buildings shall have good aesthetic and architectural quality, ensure they maintain and enhance the values, et cetera. So, I mean, we're using durable here, and, again, I was just looking, is there a term that covers this better than what the language is? And again, that's a question mark.
Maybe we'll put that on our 2019.
There you go. Well, we can look into whatever other new products come in too.
Synthetic wood. If there's no other discussion as it sits now, I will open the public hearing. And if anybody would like to speak to this, please come to the podium. And seeing nobody, I will close the public hearing. And believe we have to make a recommendation to send to the city council, and it doesn't sound like there's any major shifts to what Mr. Zuber's presented tonight. So if anybody wants to discuss more or make a motion, now would be a good time to do that.
I would move the planning commission recommend to city council approval of the proposed ordinance as written.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
A second by Commissioner Marovich. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? And the motion passes. Deb, is that going to be discussed or that be on a consent agenda at the?
It will go based on council policy to the consent agenda. They can pull it off, but
Okay. And will that go next Tuesday, the
yes, 10/17.
17? Okay.
Eric, it sounds like everybody else has thanked you. I'd like to thank you as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all.
Very good work.
It was very enjoyable working with you.
Hope to see you back here again soon.
Come back and see us, Eric.
not last, the next item on our agenda is updates. Usually we'll ask staff when our next comp plan and planning commission meeting is.
Yep, we've got the draft for the next planning commission meeting. Our next comprehensive plan meeting is on the 16th. And that will be to review the chapters of the comp plan, getting close to public hearing time. So that will be, as I said, on October 16th here in the city council chambers, starting at 6. And then the next planning commission meeting is October 23rd.
Thanks, Deb.
And I think we have 2 open houses scheduled to review the comp plan, the 18th and the 24th, is that correct?
I don't have the dates in front of me, but they are on our website, burnsville.org/2040, I believe is the link. We do have a morning open house and then a evening open house as well to accommodate
We
various
encourage people
folks.
to come out and give us
We
their
sure
feedback.
do. Yes, thank you.
That at City Hall?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. If there are no other updates, I would stand for a motion for adjournment.
So
One
mo-
question, sorry. Would it be appropriate for the planning commission to adjust the start times, seeing as city council has established the precedent?
I think we should have a full planning
The,
commission before we make that.
I think so
This-
too, but.
That would be up to the city council to make a change, not
Well,
individual
we'd
commissions.
suggest them looking at it, I suppose,
Just earlier?
probably.
Maybe we'll ask Joel what the procedure is there, but.
That would be good, yeah. I'm just curious. I mean, there was obviously a rationale behind their deciding to change theirs, and I don't know if it applies right for us or not. So, just a question.
Put that in the tickler file.
There you go.
Is there any other questions, or I would stand for a motion for adjournment?
Move to adjourn?
We have a motion, a second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye opposed, and we will see you in 2 weeks. Thank you for watching and have a good night.